From one of Australia's former leading homicide detectives, this is I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
I'm in the grocery store with my wife, and my undercover cell phone rings, and I answer it, and he says, "Hey, this is the doc. Can you talk? I got to get rid of my wife." Murder for hires had become one of our specialties that we did as undercovers. And, so I had to go home and get my recording equipment, turn the recorder on, put it in my ear, and put the phone up, telling me all about his relationship and how it had gone south. And I'm thinking, this is kind of weird. As a hitman, I don't want to hear this shit. I want to know, what are you paying me? Who is she? Where is she? Right? That's all I want to know. But as an undercover, I'm like, oh, keep talking, dude.
I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
Today I had a conversation with Lou Valoze, a former US ATF undercover agent. He's a tattooed monster of a man who spent over 20 years at the sharp end of law enforcement. He operated in a world where the stakes are high, where you make a mistake and you could very well pay for it with your life. That came at a cost, not only in his career but in his personal life. Today he took us into a world even most cops don't get to see or experience. Talking about the relationships he formed with the bad guys before he brought them down. It was heavy stuff that we talked about, including infiltrating bikie gangs, taking over 1,000 guns off the street. He was even hired as a hitman to murder a doctor's wife. He's also the author of the book, Storefront Sting, ATF Agent's Life Undercover. Lou, you worked undercover for a long time, and I know when you're passionate about your job, which you clearly were, that you can immerse yourself in there. And the question I ask you, working undercover as long as you did, you're Lou, but your undercover name was Sal. I think Sal from New York was your cover story. At any point, did you become more Sal than you were Lou?
I would say for almost a decade, I was more Sal than I was Lou. It was a lot easier to be Sal, man. Everybody loved Sal. He was he was a dangerous, fun guy who was living a hell of a life. Lou had to come home to an unhappy wife and kids, and mind you, unhappy because I was an asshole. But it was just easier for me to stay in role and be Sal, because he didn't have any problems, man. Lou Valoze had a ton of problems. Sal Nunziato was carefree. So absolutely.
It makes sense, and I do understand that, and I think the nature of the work that you do, and I experience it in law enforcement as well as a homicide cop, that you could run away from your private world and immerse yourself in your professional world, and it was easier because you just concentrated on what you had to do.
Because you didn't really have to answer to anybody in that world, other than your supervisors, which was, as long as you were doing your job, wasn't a big deal. But in the home life, you got to answer to people and the responsibilities and all that. So the more you didn't deal with those responsibilities, the worse that situation got. So the easier it was to just be the other guy, for sure.
I would imagine, undercover, the type of work you did, that it would be easy to, or thing that you'd have to look out for is not losing yourself into that world. Yeah,
it's a part of you, because I have so many people who come up to me and say, "Oh, you should go into acting because you were an actor for 20 years undercover." But it's not really acting. It's just you take a part of yourself and you just bring it to a different place, right?
Yeah.
It's you, but you just kind of unleash that part of you and you go do these crazy things. So it's just, you kind of create this other version of you.
Yeah.
And it can lead to great results professionally, and guns off the street, drugs off the street, bad guys in prison, but it can lead to disastrous results on the personal side. And it did with me.
Yeah, it takes a toll, and we'll talk about that. There's consequences of the life that you live, and that catches up every now and then. We actually had Joe Pistone on the podcast, the real Donny Brasco, and he interesting take on things, and full respect to him. I thought it was amazing the job that he did infiltrating the mafia, but he made the point that because I asked him that because he was very long term in that role that.
Mm.
How did you let's say the moral compass, like did you he said to me, and I think the advice he gave was you always had to remember that you're the good guy and not get lost in that world. Is that another trap for people that go in deep undercover? Understand what your
Oh,
role is?
it absolutely is. And Joe did a great job. I know Joe. I've done speaking engagements with him, but I think Joe, that case was Joe's big case, and he got out after that, basically. So, I want to say he was undercover 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And the smart thing to do is to get out. Like a dummy, I didn't get out. I did it for almost 20 years straight.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's two ways to look at it, right? If you do it for 5 or 6 years and get out, those are the smart ones. But
Yeah.
but the other side of that is after 5 or 6 years, man, you're just hitting your stride, right? 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
Now you know what to do and what not to do. And that's how I felt. I was like, man, I just got good at this. I want to keep going.
Yeah.
And so I just never stopped.
I understand that because in law enforcement, you've got to evolve and you become comfortable in what you're doing. And I would imagine each time you did a job or did a sting that you're learning something. You might have made a mistake and you think, okay, I'm going to fix this one up, or I know the path, and you would get very comfortable in that chaos that the world that you're operating in.
Yeah, Gary, like anything else, like all the homicide detectives I knew, and all the narc guys, men and women that I knew, uh, you know, 5 or 6 years goes by and you've made your mistakes, right? You've been
Yeah.
corrected, you've made your mistakes, and then you know what to do, you know what not to do, how to carry yourself. And you get better and better. You never stop learning, and that's how I felt about undercover work. And so I didn't want to stop, man. I came to a place where I was more comfortable in my undercover role than I was at a bar with my friends, man. You know?
Yeah. I'm sitting here looking at you, and I understand that role. Like you dropped me into a homicide scene, and that was easy for me. Socialize
Yeah.
and be the family man and all that. That can be a little bit harder. So, and I say this, and what I'm fascinated by the work that you guys do. It really is immersive. You've got to get in there, and you can't make a mistake. And you likened it to acting. I think someone made a comment because we've had some CIA dudes on and some even a French spy, and basically talking about when you're playing a role in acting. If you stuff up, well, yeah, okay, let's do that. Take again, but you can't afford to do that. Working in law enforcement undercover.
No, if and again, I always say I never really considered it acting because Sal Nunziata was just kind of who I was, part of my personality that I just took to another level. But as far as making mistakes and saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, the consequences could be dire,
Yeah.
and oftentimes they are. And unfortunately, that's how we lost some great people because of mistakes.
Yeah, and it's not just you making the mistake. The more people that know about who you're or what role you're doing, you've got people that you're not even controlling that potentially can make a mistake that can bring you undone. So I would imagine 20 years that you almost became addicted to the adrenaline of it, the excitement of it.
Yeah, without a doubt. I did an undercover deal my first day on the job. I was with two federal agencies over here before I got on with ATF, and you know, I wanted to work undercover. The other agencies I was with, I didn't have that opportunity. So as soon as I got over to ATF, they put me with this crazy guy who was my partner. And my first day, I hadn't even been to the ATF Academy yet. And I told him I want to work undercover. And he goes, "You want to work undercover? Okay, you're going to do a deal today." So I ended up that day, uh, he had an informant who introduced me to a gangbanger, big, huge guy, who wanted to sell a gun for 250 bucks. He was a convicted felon. He was a member of a gang. So, I got wired up and all that, got in a brand new undercover car and went and did the deal at a fast food restaurant at lunchtime. And I walk in with the informant and we meet the bad guy, and I'm looking up at this guy, and the informant makes the introduction. He runs out the door, and I'm like, "That's supposed to happen, right?" So this guy tells me to, hey, he goes, "Hey, follow me into the bathroom." And this is a bathroom at lunchtime of a burger joint, right?
Yeah.
There's a sink and there's a urinal and there's a commode. So he walks into the commode, the toilet, and opens the door and says, "Come on in." So I said, "I guess this is how it works." I follow him in and I go in and I'm like straddling the toilet and he comes behind me and he shuts the door and latches it. So we're face to face right here.
Pretty vulnerable.
And yeah, and so I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, wow, this is my dream. This is what I want to do. It's my first day, and it seems like I've already made some bad decisions because my options are really limited right now. So he was there to sell the gun. I knew a gun was going to come out. It was a gun deal. And he reached in his waistband. And, all I'm thinking is, how am I going to get this guy's head in this toilet if it goes bad,
Yeah.
before he can shoot me? And, but he wanted to sell the gun. My partner had given me 300 bucks. He wanted 250 for it. I just gave him 300. I gave him a $50 tip. I just wanted to get the gun and get out of there. And, so he gives me the gun. I give him the money, and we're walking out of the bathroom, and I'm like, going through my mind, I'm like,
Yeah.
are we supposed to sit down and break bread together, have a meal? How does this work? And I was like, you know what? I ran out the door just like the informant did with the
Yeah.
gun. And when I got in the car, in the undercover car, and let the team know everything was good, and I'll meet them back at the meeting location. I remember I remember it like it was yesterday. I had that little stolen gun. It was a little 25 caliber pistol. And I remember looking at it. I had put it right in the console, and that was my high right there.
Yeah.
That feeling was the greatest feeling I had ever had. I just took that gun off the streets, right? That gun that, maybe that gun had killed a whole bunch of people. Maybe it was going to kill a whole bunch of people in the
Yeah.
future, but I got it out of his hands. I took it off the streets, and that began my addiction right
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And I never looked back for the next 20 years.
I can understand how that, and one of my frustrations as a homicide detective, unless you're chasing serial killers or gangland killings when you can put a stop to it, the crimes happen and we're not preventing it, so it's reactive. This type of stuff you do, getting the guns off the street, I can understand why you get a high with that, because a gun, yeah, you've been in law enforcement long enough and you've been around long enough to know the damage one gun can do. So to get that off the street from a bad guy, it has to give you a bit of a lift and make you feel like you're doing some good work.
Yeah, for sure. Half my career was buying drugs, and there was, for me, there was zero satisfaction in buying drugs. If I did a deal with some cartel guys and I bought 20 kilos, you're not even sticking your finger in a hole in the dam,
Yeah,
right? You're not putting a dent in anything. For me, it was very, very small satisfaction. You're going to get some low level cartel guys and lock them up. That's about it. But just buying one gun, from one convicted felon, you're actually making a difference in whatever community you're working in, man. You're taking that gun off the street. My agency, that gun would, after the case is adjudicated, that gun gets destroyed, melted. It'll never be back on the street. And that gives you some fulfillment, a
yeah,
feeling that, man, I just made a little bit of a difference. Maybe I saved the kid's life. Maybe I saved the cop's life.
yeah. No, I understand that. Certainly understand it. But life could have been a lot different for you. You could have been a quiet little reserved banker because didn't your working career start out working in a bank? And
Yeah, that's
I'm looking at you now, and I'm not seeing the classic image of a banker, but that's where your path was heading.
yeah. I went to college over here and got a useless degree in economics and business, and I barely made it through college, and I was not I wasn't a hot commodity. No one was breaking down my doors to hire me on Wall Street, and so I was able to get a job just out of the newspaper at a bank, making $8 American dollars an hour, and
Yeah,
I was just sitting in a room with no windows, taking computer printouts and putting them in, filing them in file cabinets, and I just thought to myself, I can't go through life
yeah.
with a job like this. There's no way, So I knew there was something else for me out there.
Yeah, I understand it'd be a slow death if you're not happy or it's not something rewarding, and that's what you're doing just to get the paycheck each week. What
Yep.
drew you to law enforcement? What was there one thing? Did you?
Yeah, Gary, it was never on my radar.
Yeah,
I didn't grow up wanting to be a cop. It wasn't a thing. So I I had a friend who I had played ball with in college, and he just happened to call me one day. And I said I was miserable. My life was I was young, and I had no direction. I was miserable. And he said, "Man," he goes, "Why don't you come over after work, and let's have a beer, hang out." He said, I'm staying at my brother's place in the Bronx. So after work, I drove down to the Bronx, and he was sitting out on the stoop, out on the front steps. So I sat on the stoop with him, and we're having a beer, and a Corvette pulls up, right? Which is pretty rare in the Bronx to see a Corvette. And this guy gets out of the car, and he's got, this is way back when in the like Miami Vice days and all, and
yeah,
he's got the long hair flowing back, and his shirt's open, and I can see he's got a Beretta 92F in his waistband. And I'm looking at this guy going, wow, now that's a cool guy right there, and that was his brother. I had never met him before. He just happened to be undercover Drug Enforcement Administration agent. He was an undercover DEA agent, and he had recently gotten back from South America, and he was working undercover. And we went inside, and we had a few beers at the table. And for about 30 minutes, I asked him questions about his job, and he told me what he could tell me.
yeah,
And it was right then in that conversation that the skies opened up, and I knew I wanted to be an undercover agent.
yeah. I
I didn't
that
want to.
you
Yeah,
I can understand that time, and you referenced Miami Vice. I think we had a lot of cops over here that were watching that show, and there was a lot of undercover dudes getting around, looking very cool, and yeah, they had the swagger about them. So I can understand the attraction. It was a cool scene that they seemed to inhabit. So law enforcement in the US is different in Australia. Here we've got state police and we've got federal police. So we've got 4 or 5 or 6 law enforcement agencies roughly um,
okay.
covering the country. But in America, like you ended up and your undercover work was in the ATF, and that's a federal agency. That
Right.
wasn't your direct path into law enforcement. You joined other agencies before you got to the ATF. Do you want to just talk us through that and explain what the roles are in those agencies?
Yeah, so I wanted to work undercover, but as you know, like if you want to be a homicide detective, you don't just become a homicide detective,
Yeah,
right? You have to pay your dues, right? And
yeah,
it's years and years. After that conversation I told you about, it was 8 years until I actually did my first
okay,
undercover deal.
yeah,
So what I did was, I didn't want to be a uniformed police officer. I didn't want to be writing traffic tickets, pulling people over. I wanted to be an undercover agent. So I didn't put in with the city police or the state police. I put in with we call them the alphabet agencies, all the 3-letter agencies. I put in with every single one. We had ICE, ATF, DEA, FBI, all of them over here,
Yep.
right? Um, I really wasn't very qualified, to be honest with you. I had no experience, no law enforcement experience. I didn't have very good grades in school. So I put in, and I actually, I when you put in over here for the feds, you take a test, an examination.
Okay.
And the only advantage I have, usually most of the guys taking this examination are police officers who want to become feds. They want
Okay.
to, move up to be a fed. So they've been removed from the school system usually for, 7 or 8 years. They're gritty cops by this time. I was fresh out of school, so I was still in test taking mode, and I just happened to score really high on the test, which is
Yeah.
the only reason I got a phone call.
Okay.
And I got a phone call from immigration, which is it's known over here as ICE now, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's not what it was called back then, but so it was for a job to be a special agent with the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. So I was in New York. The job was in LA. They flew me out to LA for the interview, and again, I think I did really good in the interview only because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So sometimes that's when you do your best, right?
Hey,
When you're clueless.
ignorance helps. Ignorance can
Yes,
help a
it
great deal.
does.
Yeah.
Right? I went in there and I was just myself, and I was real honest, and I wasn't expecting to get hired or expecting much. And when I got back from LA, I didn't even have a suit. My dad had to help me buy a suit for the interview, and I tucked my long hair into the back of my jacket and went in. And within a week of the interview, I got a call. I say, "Hey, man, listen, pending your successful background investigation, we're going to offer you a job as a special agent in Los Angeles." So, um, I passed the background and I went in, went down to the academy. I had never seen a gun, never held a gun. Again, I was as green as you could be. I
Mm.
was unqualified. I was green, and but I was hungry, man. I was hungry, man. I was gonna realize my dream. So I worked super hard. It was a long, hard academy. I made it through, and the next thing I knew, I was on the streets of Los Angeles, and it was the greatest time in America to be a cop, to be in law enforcement. Was in the early 90s. I was in LA from 1991 to 1996, and it
That
was
would have been
when LA
chaotic.
was this was during the LA riots. I don't know if you
Okay.
guys
Yeah,
pointed out
no,
over
we
there.
we definitely heard about and watched it from over here. Would have been
It
chaos.
was when we really had that invasion. It was the beginning of the invasion of all the Central American gangs coming
Mm.
into America, and LA was like the epicenter. So, you had the MS-13, coming in from El Salvador, and all of the Mexican gangs and the cartels, um, Guatemalan, Honduran gangs coming up. And the gangs that were already, our homegrown gangs in Los Angeles, in America, they didn't know what to do with this, right?
They took it to another level.
They had never seen this kind of violence. They were doing drive-bys and some shootings. These Central American gangs, they were cutting people's heads off. They were cutting body parts off, private parts, and shoving them in people's mouths to send a message. I mean, it was
Yeah.
next level gang warfare, and I was lucky enough to be on the streets during that and to battle that. And I really that's where I learned how to be a cop from the Los Angeles Police Department detectives
Yeah.
that I got to work with. They taught me how to be a cop,
Yeah, I could
and
imagine.
yeah, so it was incredible, man. It was a great learning experience for me. It's where I learned kind of how to carry myself. And I'll just tell you what I did, I think that made a difference. So the way they did it back then was your first 6 months on the job, they put you in LA County Jail. So every day I went to LA County Jail to interview uh, on the release line, every foreign-born inmate that was coming out of LA County Jail to determine their alienage and their deportability.
Yep.
All right. And if you determined they were deportable, you would, write up detainers and fill everything out and hand the paperwork in, and they would not get released. They would go, into federal custody. But what I would do was, I was fascinated by these guys. Here I am talking to this guy who has been cutting people's heads off, right? Some guy from El Salvador who grew up in some dirt hut in San Salvador, who ended up somehow on the streets of LA as an enforcer, for MS-13. And he's out there killing, selling drugs, uh, chopping people's heads off. And I would talk to these guys. I was genuinely interested in their story. Like how did you go from being a little kid, in these very simple beginnings to where you are and what you're doing? And it's funny, even hardened criminals, when you really talk to them and they see that you have a genuine interest, they'll talk,
Yeah.
right? They'll tell their story. And I would pass that information on to our gang units, right? And our gang units were like, "Hey, man, this rookie, he's going the extra mile, man. He's passing information on. He gets it." And I think that kind of helped me in my career, to start getting out as I got known. This guy's a worker. He's a go-getter, man.
Well, what you've said there, Lou, I understand, because if you have that inquiry in mind, and dare I say, and it's not used all the time, but empathy, that understanding the path that brought people to when they're sitting behind the gates in prison, it can give you a deeper understanding. It helps you if you can communicate with them on their level. It helps you all the way through your career in law enforcement, being able to have a conversation with people, not sit there and judge, and not just go, "Oh, well, you're a bad guy. You got nothing to say that I'm interested in." If you sit down and spend time, it does make a difference, doesn't it?
And that's human nature, right, Gary? That's human
Mm.
nature, right? Everybody had a mom at some point, right? That held them as a baby when they came out. And I wanted to know from these guys, how did you get here? How did it happen? Tell me, and it turned out that a lot of these guys, the real story, which a lot of people didn't get
Mm.
into, their families back in El Salvador were being closely watched. And if they didn't carry out their mission and do what they're supposed to do, their families would get killed, right?
Yeah.
The gangs would kill their families. So again, you can't make excuses for criminality and for these kind of bad things, but it gives you a pretty good understanding. And I would talk to them about that. Hey, man, tell me. And plus, I'd be doing these interviews in Spanish, which was a second language for me,
Yeah.
which made it even harder. And I just really found that you get so much more information when you treat everyone with respect and with dignity. Unless of course they give you a reason not to. But right off the bat, I always treated everyone with respect. I treated them with dignity, and I found that got me a lot farther in law enforcement than being a tough guy.
I think sometimes law enforcement types make the mistake of being the hard ass the whole time, and that's not often the way you get through to what you need done. You talk about El Salvador and those Central American crime groups that come from places like that. We had Rick Prado on the podcast, CIA dude that worked over there, and you said that your local gangs in LA, these new gangs took it to another level. So I could imagine from being a cop on the street, it would have been interesting time. So you went from there, then you ended up in where'd you go from there? You did it after the
So
immigration.
yeah, so again, there was not going to be a place for me to work undercover.
You still
Um,
wanted
you know,
to
we
be the Miami Vice dude. You still
absolutely.
you still had that dream. Yep.
And it's interesting with the Miami Vice thing, when how reality versus television. In my mind, of course, I'm thinking undercover work. I'm going to be on yachts. I'm going to be driving Lamborghini. I'm going to be surrounded by supermodels and champagne. and it could not be any farther from the truth. I was I was in trailer parks and the projects, and I was driving old shitty beat up cars, and there was never any super. Anyway, from we had guys working undercover, but they for the most part they were the Hispanic guys,
Yeah.
who were going in, who were doing buying fake green cards and fake documents and all that. So I wanted to get back to the East Coast of America. The West Coast never really, yeah, just it was. I
Didn't
never felt at
replicate.
home there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I jumped over to the U.S. Marshals on their fugitive squad, and I was only there for 2 years. I was in New York and I was in Puerto Rico, chasing fugitives, which was a blast, right? As well, this as a cop. The more action and the less paperwork you have to do, the more fun the job is, right? And
100%.
yeah, because what they don't show on TV, right, whether you're a homicide detective or an undercover officer, is that 80% of the time you're banging out reports. They don't show that on TV. The fugitive investigations and chasing fugitives was 80% action and 20% reports.
Yeah, well, I
Uh,
would imagine the brief is done. You've got the evidence. You just got to find this dude,
that's
and
it.
yeah,
You're kicking doors in, man. So it was great, and I was having a good time doing it. But again, I wanted to work undercover. So uh, ATF was a small agency over here, and only maybe 20, 24, 2,500 agents, and they weren't hiring very much back in the 1990s.
mm,
And finally, an opening came up. They were hiring one class, and they were only hiring people who were already agents from other agencies.
okay,
So you could jump over. You didn't have to go through the first part of the academy. I think there was only like 24 positions open. I put in, I got it. Um, so after the fugitive chasing for about 2 years, I finally got on with ATF. Um, I really wanted to go to, they give you three choices where you can go. So I wanted the action. I put in for New York, Miami, or Los Angeles because I just wanted to be in one of our, the biggest cities with the most action.
yeah,
And they sent me to Savannah, Georgia. And that's the logic of the US government. And but it worked out because I just happened to get in an office with and get partnered up with this crazy guy who was a brilliant undercover agent, and it just set me off on my career. And I started working undercover right from the bat,
yeah.
and it
You
was a
get
progression.
get that right mentor in law enforcement that sets you up, doesn't it? If you've got someone that you can learn from, someone that's got the smarts, someone's got the values that you've got, and follow their lead, it makes a big difference. Can set you up for your whole career. Getting the right person.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Like I know, because I worked with and knew a lot of homicide detectives over here, and every young patrolman on the street dreams of being a homicide detective, right? They
Yeah,
want to. That's again, you got to pay your dues. You got to prove yourself, move up slowly, and pay your dues. So it was the same to be an undercover agent. You didn't just come on and become an undercover agent. And my goal was I wanted to do these long-term, deeply embedded undercover cases where I was traveling all over the country and getting in with these organized crime groups.
yeah,
But my partner showed me, he's like, listen, you start small and you work your way up. So for years and years, I started out, buying one little bag of crack off some, 18-year-old gangbanger in the parking lot of the shopping mall.
yeah,
Buying a stolen gun off a convicted felon, behind the bowling alley. That's what I did for my first couple of years, and you slowly build up and work your way into conspiracies and maybe some small street gangs
yeah.
and doing that kind of stuff. And if you prove yourself and if your name gets out there, you will get the call, to start doing these long-term, deeply embedded undercover operations.
It makes sense learning the trade. Lou, what do you reckon the qualities of a good, and it's hard to generalise because everyone comes in with different skill set, but what do you think are the attributes of a good undercover officer?
What I see in common when I'm, we had an ATF, we had the EUP, we call it, the Enhanced Undercover Program, and it was just a collection of agents from all over the country who specialized in undercover work.
Yeah.
The most amazing crew you'll ever see, right? I mean, you see them all in a room. It looked like prison just got out, right? But the characteristics, like you spend some time with these people, and here's what you notice first and foremost. When you get beyond what we looked like,
Yeah.
these are some of the smartest people you'll ever meet, right? You cannot be a dummy. These are really smart, educated people. And probably the main characteristic is the ability to think on your feet, right? The ability to always know what to say. They're all pistols, man, with the responses. Like they're all so quick to respond. And they could sell you anything. You got to be a salesman. You have to be a natural salesman. If you look at that real slimy car salesman who's very successful, who's probably selling a car that he knows isn't the right car for that person, but he'll say whatever he has to say to make that deal. You could make that person into an undercover. So those are the kind of characteristics. It's not bravery. To me, it wasn't who's fearless. That wasn't it at all.
Yeah.
Who's got the ability to make that sale, because that's what you're really doing. You're selling your load of bullshit, to get people to want to follow you, to want to be part of your hustle, or to let you into their hustle. It's a sales pitch.
It makes sense because you're either selling yourself that people want to speak to you, selling a product, or purchasing your guns, your drugs, whatever. There's one side of it, and we'll touch on it because both of us don't like it very much, the paperwork associated with it. So just to clarify the reality of, I know obviously in homicide we've worked with undercover guys and girls, and the amount of paperwork that goes with it, there's an accountability because when you're as an undercover officer, invariably if you're giving evidence at court, the defence barrister, solicitors are going to attack you. Well, you're a professional liar, aren't you? So it's all about recording and documenting. That's another side of it that you've got to be very keep accountable documents and spend a lot of time recording everything that you do.
Yeah, it's funny how they don't show that part in the movies or on the television shows, right? So, yeah, and when you think about it, everything you do out there, for every minute of action, that all has to be accounted for somewhere in a report.
Yeah.
So very similar, to a homicide investigation. You know that every single person you interview, right? Every single piece of evidence you collect, no matter what it is, you have to go back to the office, get on your computer, and well, when I started, it was typewriters, but anyway, you get on there, and that all has to be logged in. That all has to be accounted for, and you have to regurgitate everything. Even if you recorded it, you still have to regurgitate, what was said, what you took from that interview, summarize it. So if you, and that's another thing, you asked about the characteristics of a good undercover. All the best undercovers were really tight with their paperwork because you had to be. And for the exact reason you said, if you were not good with you could be the greatest undercover in the world. If you couldn't translate that onto paper and your reports weren't tight, you would get torn up in court by a good defense attorney.
Yeah.
So the ability to translate what you did, what you heard, what you saw onto paper was so important. That was a huge aspect of the job, because if you couldn't do that, you're going to lose in court, and then everything you did was all for nothing anyway.
Yeah, it's And it's I've seen it. I've seen undercovers in court in murder trials and that, and it's ruthless. The cross examination they get to discredit everything that's come on. Taking away from the paperwork, the courts, and all that. How do you gain the trust of the people you're targeting? Because quite often you get dropped in cold, or you might have an informant, and you've got to build that trust. And I heard you say in one of the interviews, it's not you don't walk in there as the toughest guy in the room. You've got to just build trust. How do you build that trust up when you get dropped into an environment?
I think all of us who did it, we would draw on our own personal experiences
Yeah.
on life. So, and I use this analogy, and I know it's very corny, but it's very similar to if you see a girl you're very attracted to, and you want to you're going to do a cold approach, right? You
Yep.
see she's bellied up to the bar.
Yeah.
You know, how are you going to do that, right? You don't want to come on too strong, right? You don't want to be real standoffish and cool, right? Because so you got to figure out, you have to first you have to assess her personality,
Yeah.
right? And then you have to figure out what's the best way to keep her engaged with me, to keep her talking to me so that I can get a phone number. All right. And that's very similar to undercover work, right?
Mm.
So first thing you got to do is you assess your target, whether it's outlaw bikers, the mafia, the cartels, whoever it may be, the gangster disciples, street gangs. You assess who you're going after, and then come up with a technique or a plan. And if you don't think that your personality is going to work, maybe you're not the right undercover, right? Maybe you
Yeah,
need to
that's
say, hey,
important.
listen, I think someone else, right? Know your limitations. So my approach was always, listen, I'm not trying to become a member of the Sinaloa cartel. All right.
Yeah.
I'm a big nosed Italian. They're not going to let me in. So my goal, I never tried to necessarily become a member, but I wanted them to want to become a part of my hustle.
Yeah.
So I would let them see me and know that I had my own hustle going on and make them want to be around me, right? You always want to be the most popular guy in the room, so people are kind of drawn to you. So you want to do that with the bad guys, with your targets. Make them want to be a part of your hustle. Like, hey man, what's that guy going on, and how can I make money off him?
Mm.
That was always my approach. Not to say, listen, I want to be a Hell's Angel. I want to. My approach was, listen, here's, I see what you got going on, man. I see your hustle. Here's what I got going on. Maybe we can work together and make some money, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you can help me and I can help you.
Uh,
That is how I went into it. Never a hard sale, never a hard push. I would just put out there how I could help them, what I had to offer,
Because
and let them see how I roll.
the people you're dealing with too, they got the street smarts. They'll smell you out. They'll smell a cop a mile away. And if you come on too hard, you're going to be fobbed off. But you got to make it. I understand what you're saying. You got to dangle it out there, get them curious, and want to reach out to you. So I dare say they think they're in control of the pace of what's developing here as well.
Yeah, for sure. You don't you don't want to that's why, like we talked about earlier, that tough guy approach rarely ever works. If you come on too strong and come out as a tough guy, and yeah, I did time in this prison and that prison. First of all, those things are easily
Checked.
checked on, right?
Mm.
And if you talk shit, you say you were in this prison or that, but you better know, what cell block were you in. You better know all that information, right? Because
Yeah.
they do. I guarantee if they don't, their friends do.
Yeah.
So it's always super important to keep everything as real as you can keep it, and as close to home as you can keep it. So that they don't feel like you're trying to necessarily run a hustle on them. They feel like, wow, hey, this guy obviously he wants to make some money off us. Can we make some money off him? and maybe we can work together and be in business together. Because, what I found was no matter who I was working, whether they were, supposedly these, white supremacist groups, or whether they were Mexican cartels, Italian mafia, black street gangs, none of that, Matt, none of them had any real ideology or any of that. It was always about money. They would deal with anyone who could make them money if they trusted them.
Yeah,
That's what it was always about.
that's interesting. So you found what they're looking for and get them curious about it. I want to take you into one case that's mentioned in your book, and being a homicide detective as long as I am, seeing someone preventing a homicide is great. I'm talking about the doctor, where your role was as a hired hitman to knock off his wife. Do you want to tell us through that story? Because I think that gives an interesting insight into the type of good that undercover operatives can do.
Yeah, that was a very bizarre case, and it was, for me, it was a big deal in my career because it actually went to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, and it made case law. And it's the reason why an undercover cell phone is now considered a device, a communication device in interstate commerce. So if you use one of these, it in the commission of a murder for hire,
Yeah.
they can take it federally right away. They can
Okay.
take it.
All right.
So this very well-known, very respected doctor, and he was actually a doctor for the LPGA, the Ladies Professional Golf Association. Um, he he was married to a much younger, attractive woman, and the marriage was going south, and there were financial issues there. Um, on his property, he had a second house that he rented out. He happened to live very close to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center,
All right.
where our academy is and many other academies are. And it was not uncommon for a lot of the instructors, to rent local houses, local apartments. And he had a guy who was living in this house who was he was a former military, one of those secret squirrel guys who was a firearms instructor at the academy. And the doctor was really into guns and all that. And they had kind of, the guy was renting a house from him, and they had become friends, and he would work on the doctor's guns and all that. And one day the doctor approached him and said, "Hey man, I know you were in that world, that whole secret spy world and all that." Uh, he said, "Would you know anyone who could help me out? I got to get rid of my wife." And I mean, there was
Yeah.
trust there. They had known each other, and this guy was like, he kind of blew him off. But I guess like the third time the doctor asked him, he was like, "Man, this guy is serious."
Yeah, it's not a throwaway
So
line. I want to kill my wife. It's he's starting to
right,
plan it. Yeah.
yep. So, ATF, we had over here in America, that was murder for hires had become one of our things, one of our specialties, uh, that we did as undercovers. And this guy, he went to his supervisor who directed him to go up to our office, and he sat down with my supervisor and told him the story. So my supervisor called me in, and he told me the story, and so I gave him my undercover cell phone number, and I said, "Listen, don't approach him about it. Don't say anything else to him. If he comes to you again, tell him, yeah, say, listen, I have somebody you can talk to. Give him my number." And he said, "Okay," and he left. And honestly, with murder for hires, I never really thought about it again, because we would get that more often than you think, because a lot of people talk crazy, they're like,
Yeah.
"I want to kill this guy. I want to have him killed." Um, but as you know, some people do carry through with it. They
Yeah.
will. And a couple weeks later, I'm in the grocery store with my wife, and my undercover cell phone rings. It was a number I didn't recognize, and I answer it, and he says, "Hey, this is the doc. Can you talk?" And I had to think real quick, and I was like, "Oh boy, that's the doctor down there." So I told him, I said, yeah, let me get somewhere I can talk. I'll call you back in 15 minutes or whatever. And back then you couldn't just, this is cell phones had just come out. And, so I had to go home and get my recording equipment, turn the recorder on, put it in my ear and put the
Yeah.
phone up. And so I talked to him and we set up a meeting. And I ended up meeting him at like a public place at a restaurant. And I let him do all the talking. I guarantee you in that first meeting, I probably didn't say 25 words.
Mm.
And he really started going into in the first meeting, telling me all about his relationship and how it had gone south. And I'm thinking, this is kind of weird, at because now I'm in hitman, wearing hitman uniform, and I'm thinking, as a hitman, I don't want to hear this shit. I want to know, what are you paying me? Who is she? Where is she? Right? That's all I
Yeah.
want to know. But as an undercover, I'm like, oh, keep talking, dude. Right?
Yeah.
Keep talking, because this is all good. Because my that first partner I told you about, he had taught me from the beginning. When you're working undercover, shut your mouth. Nobody's going to prison based on what you say. They're going to prison based on what they say. So shut your mouth and let them talk.
Good advice. Great
So
advice.
yeah. So he went into the whole story about, her and, how terrible she was and all that. And so I think at that first meeting, I might have gotten her name, and he wrote down on a piece of paper for me uh, where she works and what her address is. And when you're doing a murder for hire, that stuff is great because when you go to trial, and they almost always do, you want to put as much on the table as you can because they're always going to say it was entrapment.
Yeah.
So the more evidence you have beside just the conversation, if all you have is a conversation, it's not nearly as strong. But if you can put some evidence on the table, it makes it so much stronger. So at least I got a piece of paper in his handwriting. He wrote out her name, her address, and her place of employment. Why else would you do that?
Yeah.
Unless,
Yeah.
you want
That
the
it's
hitman to kill.
definitely adds some weight to the case, doesn't it? In that getting
For
that
sure.
evidence in that manner.
But what happened next, I couldn't even believe it happened. So we had several meetings, and I ended up telling him, and this was just a shot in the dark, a total shot in the dark. I had told him that the way I was going to do it was I was going to make it look like a robbery. I was just an everyday robbery. I stick a gun in her face, give me all your jewelry, all your money, all that. And over here, robberies go bad all the time, and the victim
Yep.
gets shot anyway. So that's how that was going to happen. So again, I don't know why I did this, but I did it. I said, listen, this would be a lot better if you can get me a gun, a good, clean gun to do it with. And he said, yeah, I get you a gun. And in our next meeting, he brought a 38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver for me to kill his wife. So
Okay.
now you're talking about evidence, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. Now I could put the writings he made, her name, her place of employment, her address, the the conversation, and the gun he gave me to kill her.
Yeah.
And so again, it's incredible evidence. So we had several meetings, we had several phone calls, and again, usually at this point, most of these cases here in America, that would be a state charge. A murder for hire, but there is a federal charge. But for a federal charge here in the States, you have to show there's an interstate nexus for any federal charge.
Yeah.
So
Cross
if
borders.
it's any charge, yeah, any charge, if there's a gun involved, all you have to do is you have to show that that gun at some point crossed the state line. So if the gun was made in Florida and you arrested the guy with the gun in South Carolina, obviously that gun at some point crossed the state line. It's as simple as that. Um, so we ended up after all that happened, and we had to actually bring her and her daughter in during the case because the government got worried that maybe I wasn't the only person he was talking to. Maybe he had a backup plan. So just in
That's a
case.
You've brought up an aspect. These are the other things, like when you're talking it through, okay, that's logical, that's logical. But I was curious about that because once you know someone's got a plan to have someone knocked, you've got a risk that you've got to address. And I was wondering how you did that.
Yeah.
That
And that was one of the um, toughest talks of my life. They brought her in. She had no idea. She
mm,
had no idea why they went to her job and said, "We really need to talk to you, but we can't do it here." And she's like, "What do you want?" And they're like, "Listen, we really can't do it here. So will you please come with us?" And she was like, "Well, I need my daughter." So they had to go get the daughter out of school and they brought her to a hotel. And, we had to tell her, "Listen, your husband is hiring someone to kill you." That is a tough thing to hear, that your spouse is hiring a person to kill you.
yeah,
Um, and then I had to talk to her. And obviously there were tears, and I mean the emotions were crazy, as you can imagine. And she was a strong woman. Let me tell you, we actually got her. I don't want to say it like that.
yeah,
She agreed to make a recorded phone call for
yeah,
us, and which was another great piece of evidence. Um, we told her, "Listen, it's not about him. It's about you and your daughter and your safety." And she was able to pull herself together and make a very damning phone call to him, where he went crazy and yelled and said bad things. So it was good evidence again. And so we took them into protective custody. And I had met with him in person on a couple occasions. We had talked on the phone on several occasions. She told him during that recorded phone call she was going up to their lake house with her sister to see her sister. And we were getting ready to take him down, and he called me immediately after. And this was crazy. He said, "Well, maybe you could drown her. Maybe you could get in the water when she swims and pull her under and drown her." And I said, "Listen, man, we agreed on how I'm going to do this. I can't even swim." So I always gave him an out. I said, "Listen, if you're not serious, tell me now."
yeah.
And he was like, "No, no, no." He goes, maybe you could just like get her on the side of the road." So we agreed to the way that I would. And after that, when he hung up, he called me from a payphone. There was payphones back then.
Mm,
Called me from a payphone, and he was being surveilled. When he hung up, agents zoomed in and arrested him. And how we turned that case federal was that when he called me from his cell phone when we had conversations, he was in South Georgia, which is right on the border of North Florida.
yeah.
The signal bounced off a tower in Jacksonville, Florida, back up to my phone in Georgia. And this sounds real chicken shit, and it is.
Oh well,
But that was
they them the rules. Yeah.
that's
Okay.
right. Hey, whatever, hey, however you can do it. So
That
that was our interstate nexus, that he used this cell phone, and it affected interstate commerce because the signal bounced to Florida
yeah.
back up to Georgia. So um, he went to trial and he lost. The jury found him guilty, but they appealed it and it went all the way. They didn't appeal it and say he's not guilty. They appealed it and said they fabricated federal jurisdiction by
Okay.
this whole
Yep.
hokey cell phone tower thing. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court made the decision and said, no, this device is
Yep.
interstate commerce.
Okay.
So
Well,
that, that was that.
that would have changed the landscape for quite a few things. Doing a
Yep.
job like that, there's a lot of satisfaction, but there's a little anecdote to that one that occurred years later. If I read it correctly in the book, that you were in a restaurant with your wife and family years and years down the track, and a waiter was looking at you. Is that the case that it relates to? You want to tell that story? Because I think it's something that would have given you a real a kick along as the work that you've done. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so that girl, when they pulled her in, she was just a kid, man. She was maybe 13 or 14 years old.
This is a
Uh,
daughter.
the, the daughter of
Yeah.
the doctor's wife.
Yep.
And he was not her biological father. He had adopted her. So yeah, maybe 7 years later, I'm at a restaurant with my wife and kids, and the waitress, young, attractive lady, kept staring at me, and I'm like, "Ew, geez," you know. uh, I had no idea who she was. I couldn't place her or anything like that. Finally, she came up to me, and she started crying and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "I do not." And she said, "You saved my mother's life," and told me who she was and all that. And we hugged it out, and it was a very special moment for me, because as an undercover agent, I would go to a town or a city
Yeah.
and do my job and leave, right?
Yeah.
I usually wouldn't even be there for the arrest. I would leave and I'd be on to the next one. And so you very rarely do you ever see the fruits of your labor, or do you even interact with victims or anything like that. And this was really the first time in my undercover career that I ever felt a sense of, wow, here's a life that I was able to affect in a positive way through my work. And it meant a lot to me.
Yeah, I can imagine it would, and that's something tangible for the sacrifices and the effort and the chaos that goes on with your life doing the type of work. Lou, we might take a break here. There's so much to cover. When we come back, I want us to talk about the storefront strategies. A little bit
Okay.
of street theatre. I like that. That always gives me a giggle when you create that. But also about the impact it's had on you, the life that you've lived, and the type of situations you've faced throughout your career as a law enforcement officer. But it's like law enforcement on steroids, I reckon, when you go undercover. It's really at the sharp end. So when we get back, we'll have a chat about that. Looking forward to it.